Uh, Welcome to the fourth session of season 2 of the Asha Ganga Jamni online series. I am sorry that due to certain technical reasons, we are starting a few minutes late. Today, my excitement is actually at the peak. But let me first of all wish all of you uh, on a festival which has just gone by. Happy Diwali, the festival of lights, gaiety, and victory of good over evil. It is also the festival of celebrating knowledge and its victory over ignorance. To some, Diwali marks the entry of a victorious Ram to his Ayodhya. To others, it's a celebration of Lord Krishna defeating the demon Narakasura. To Jains, it marks the final liberation of Mahavir. For Sikhs, it is the occasion which marks the release of Guru Hargobind Singh Ji from the Mughal prison. It is a festival which was also celebrated by the Mughals with much fanfare. Further, my excitement knows no bounds as today we have gathered to discuss about a place which is close to my heart, Fathpur Sikri, the grand city of victory planned by Akbar. And on top of everything else, we will be discussing this city with one of the greatest experts of the field, Professor Atillio Petruccioli. There are many who have worked on Fathpur Sikri, most prominent of them being E.W. Smith, Saeed Ahmad Rezavi, Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi, and Satish Dawar. An equally heavyweight name to add to these is that of Petruccioli. He is basically an architect, a professor of architecture at University of Roma, a former Aga Khan Professor of Architecture for Islamic Societies at MIT, and director of Aga Khan program at MIT and Harvard University, where he served between 1994 to 1998. Registered as an architect since 1974 and associated with American Institute of Architects, AIA, he has been consulted and has provided professional advice in the field of Islamic heritage and development in most of the Arab countries like Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. As a result of his long-lasting and passionate interest in both architectural design and history of Islamic architecture, he has written and edited 34 books and more than 210 articles on various topics. Among them, at least 3 books deal with Fathpur Sikri. The first of them is Fathpur Sikri, the town of the sun and waters. It was published from Roma in 1988. The second book on Fathpur Sikri was Fathpur Sikri, the amazing imperial capital city of Akbar. Once again, this was a book which was in Italian, published from Milan in 2007. Unfortunately for us, both these very important works have not been translated into English and actually are not easily available in India as well. I was able to see his first book only after he had presented a copy of it in our center's library. The second book, if one goes by its reviews, is quite detailed and comprehensive. I have a PDF version of it, which the author kindly sent to me. The third one, however, is in English, which he wrote along with Thomas Dix in 1992. It is basically a book with a commentary by him and photographs by Thomas Dix. This too is unfortunately not available in India. I saw it personally in the British Library in London. Probably his first path-breaking paper on Akbar's capital city was uh, the process evolved by control systems of urban design in the Mughal epoch in India, the case of Fathpur Sikri, which had been published in a journal known as Environmental Design in 1984. It is a journal which was which was being or is being published by the Islamic Environmental Design Research Center in Italy, and he was the editor of this journal. My first meeting with him was in 1993. It was probably 1993 or 94. When he came to Aligarh, and I had the good fortune of accompanying him to Sikri without being actually aware of who he was. It was purely my luck, for he was supposed to have been accompanied by someone else from my department, who unfortunately at the last moment refused to go, and destiny chose me instead. And during that trip, I learned my basic knowledge about Fathpur Sikri from him. Welcome, Professor Petruccioli. It's really an honor to be talking to you this day. I have been waiting for this day since a very long period. Welcome, sir, and let us start with a certain discussion on the three works which you have done on Fathpur Sikri. The first one which you had done in the earlier one, 1988. What was that book about? Because it is in Italian, and most of us Indians are actually not aware, except for the fact that all of us have, some of us have seen the book, as well as the excellent plans which you have included in that book. So please, sir, please explain to us what was the basic theme of your first work, what it accomplished, and then tell us something about the second work, which I hear is the larger one of the two.
First of all, happy Diwali to all of you. And thank you, Professor Rezavi, for the very generous presentation that you made of me. Actually, it's a lot of time ago, so I have to sit in the morning a bit to concentrate and rethink what I have done about Fathpur Sikri, but mostly what I didn't do and what should be done yet. That's still open. The story of Fathpur Sikri and my story of Fathpur Sikri is very simple. In '68, by car, me and my wife, we decided to go to India from Italy. It was a small Volkswagen, and so we went and we traveled in India. We stayed 6 months, and we came back safely. And we loved, but particularly we got engaged in love with Fathpur Sikri. I have to explain in 2 words what was Fathpur Sikri at that time. It was a little village, and all the archaeology was disseminated on the top of the ridge. There were no people at all. Once in a while, one tourist, but it was desert, and the city was quite preserved, quite well preserved, particularly the palace, as you can see today, and the mosque, of course, that was care of by the people, by the believers. So, in the same time, I realized that in spite of the excellent work made by the Archaeological Survey, and particularly Vincent Smith, the 4 books that are beautiful and also charming drawings of the most important monuments, particularly the palace and the mosque. There was no general vision of the city, and most of these structures that were not included in the palace were not surveyed at all. But also, as an architect and passionate of the cities, I realized that it was difficult to locate, to establish the relationship between the monuments, between the palace and the other structures that were related to the palace or related to the dwellings of the nobles and so on and so forth. So the first important thing, I decided that it was to draw a map, a plan of the city. To my knowledge, there was no plan, not available. I never saw, actually, until now, a detailed plan of the city. There were no aerial photos at all available. I saw my first aerial photo at the end of the 90s, actually. So anyway, I decided that the first thing was the basic work, that of making a survey of the existing situation, and that happened in the next summers. So I invested the summers in 71, 70, 71, and 72 to survey the structures that were there. And so the big map that I published together with the first book is actually the result of that surveying that I made with the theodolite, with the help of the kids and so on, in the total desert, and nobody was disturbing me. It was just the heat, the minor problem. I was happy when I saw the first aerial photo, satellite photo, at the end of the 90s, to realize that actually my survey is quite precise and quite well done. So I'm glad of it. So immediately after, I started studying the city and the single monuments, and surveyed the most important monuments and so on, and remeasured the palace itself. And I started writing the first conclusions about the books, the first book. That actually was done in the 80s, but it appeared later on at the end of the 80s. The book is a book made by an architect, which means that the difference between the historians, or the pure historians, and the architects is that the historians, they have to understand the truth, and they also have to describe the reality. We are architects that we have to be prepared to transform this reality. So in few words, we design also the reality, and therefore use also this approach of the project as an instrument of reading this reality. And the first book is very much influenced by of looking at the reality with the eyes of an architect, of a designer. the book as a chapter that is dedicated to the general vision of the territory, not only the land around Fathpur Sikri, but also the wider territory, trying to also to understand the relationship that existed between the former capital Agra, the other cities, important cities like Bharatpur and Ajmer and so on, but also the geographical condition that is quite peculiar because Fathpur Sikri is in the middle of a plain, completely flat, but it's on the top of a very long ridge that is the only hill, if you want, in the middle of that plain. And the geographical setting is quite impressive and quite important. And it must have been much more impressive when the artificial lake of Akbar was existing. As you know, it was dried up by the British and cultivated, and so nowadays, it doesn't exist anymore. I was lucky because in 73, if I'm not wrong, there was a flood while I was there. And so, in a certain way, naturally, the lake reappeared. And I had a clear sensation of the wonderful space that space mitigated also by the freshness of the lake. So I was able to imagine, not necessarily I was able to catch perfectly, but I was able to imagine the life that was performed by the court at the edges, at the shores of the lake, or overlooking the water from the top of the hill and so on. And it was easy to imagine Akbar from the top of his palace, overlooking the landscape around and planning. Because, as you know, the story of Fathpur Sikri is very strange because it's a city that grew together with his planner. The planner Akbar was already sitting there in a palace that was
May I
under
stop you here?
construction.
May I
Eh?
stop you here? May I stop you here for a
Yes, of
moment?
course.
The reason which you told about, you saw the flooding of that erstwhile lake, and then you saw how it might have appeared during the period of Akbar. Was it the reason that, due to which you name your book as Fatehpur Sikri, the town of the sun and waters?
Yeah,
What made you
well,
choose this topic?
the relation with the waters, of course. The relation with the sun is a bit more subtle in the sense that I believed that the city of Fatehpur Sikri, besides many functions that was accomplishing for Akbar and the court, was also a place where he tried to play the idea of a new religion in which the pivot was the king, in which an heterodox idea of the divinity of the king was performed. Of course, in a very subtle way, using the architecture, using also the sun as a symbol also of regality, of royalty, and so on and so forth. So that's the reason of the title, basically.
Well, as you yourself explained, that it was a massive work which you did. Nobody had looked at Fatehpur Sikri from that point of view. For example, as you rightly explained, that its detailed plan was yours was one of the first which you came up with. Now,
It's disturbed. There is a disturbance.
no, what I
The
am
line
saying
is
is,
disturbed.
what I am saying is that your first book, in fact, gave the first detailed plan of Fatehpur Sikri to us, right? That becomes one of
Well,
the most. important aspects of your book.
Yes.
What,
Uh, at that time,
yeah, go ahead, go ahead. We will take the questions later on.
no,
Chalo,
no, I'm
baat karo.
reading what I'm reading the question that
Later.
that is under the
Yeah, we will take
um,
that later on.
it is okay. If you want, if I have understood your question, it is about the question of the sun and so on. But what's behind the title? Um, I have to say that in 50 years, um, I have slightly changed my view and approach to the architecture in a certain way. And I became, in the time, more, if you want, connected with the concrete and the deterministic, and less with the symbol of the things. Let's say that's in few words. At that time, in the time of my first book, I was very much interested into the question of the message that was conveyed by the architecture of Akbar in Fathpur Sikri. And I was extremely convinced that the message was that of conveying the idea of the royalty that was also divine in a certain way. And I was strongly under that. I still believe that that was a good point, an important point. But now I am much more interested into the concrete problems of the architecture. But at that time, I found, or I thought that I had found several signs of this playing with the ambiguity of the divinity and royalty in the same time. Even the use of the sun, the position of the throne, facing the sun in the morning, and also certain elements of the architecture that had no function in reality, in my opinion, that just a symbolic function of connecting, the king with the divinity or things like that.
For example, which features,
For example,
yeah, I mean, which cannot be explained except for their being suggestive of the philosophy behind them.
yes, but tell me the name of the monument that you mentioned because I didn't pick up. Can you repeat?
No, no, no. What I am saying is that you just suggested that there are certain structures which otherwise do not have a meaning or purpose, but to explain the theory of the emperor. Can you explain it further?
But there are structures that are clearly connected with this activity. The most evident, also because it is mentioned in the Ain and so on, is the courtyard, where in the Thursday night he used to congregate all the religious people of all the religions, and he had the all night discussions with them. This area that in 71 was not available, not visible, though it was possible to locate it behind the Zanana and in front of the mosque. It was later on excavated by the Aligarh University and really discovered. So it was a structure that was with more or less four sides. At the center, there was a platform that was raised with a canopy, most probably according to the miniatures and so on. And that was exactly dedicated to this function of developing this philosophy, syncretic philosophy that is behind Fathpur Sikri.
Uh,
A structure, even a structure like the so-called divanikas, okay, according the old traditional morphology given by the guides, that actually Rizvi is puts the Divanikas in another position that is more correct, more in my opinion, of course. That is an interesting structure, but that structure of that there is a space of meditation. Excuse me. Look, that it was. I wrote the name because otherwise I forget. Called the Namgira. Actually, this structure was located in the Mughal camp. So it means that it was a common structure that was in use of the emperors, at least of Akbar, which is a space where he used to meditate. Okay, and this structure that was made probably out of wood and canvas, it was consolidated in stone in the so-called Divanikas, which is, as you know, a central pillar with a platform on top, with a lot of symbolic architecture, the four chatris in the corners, and a possible hypothetical dome in the center, but definitely a ladao structure that reminds very clearly the idea of the canopy. That's a space where the message of the elevation of the individual into the divinity and into the sky is most probably suggested. Definitely, it is not a space for congregations of people and so on. Although maybe you can imagine that in special occasions he used to sit at the platform and his minister used to stand and hear whatever he had to say. But that is another very important structure that reminds, or that could remind, this idea of divinity.
Professor, now when you wrote your second book, the one which is much more detailed, I presume, I cannot pronounce its Italian name, La Capitale dell'Impero Mughal, something like that, which I translate, I don't know, I have translated it correctly or wrongly, as the amazing imperial capital city of Akbar. Now,
Yep.
what type of elements, what type of new things did you add here?
Well, that was an occasion. That was an occasion created by a publisher in Italy. The guy also got in love with Fathpur Sikri. Said, "I want to make a big book on Fathpur Sikri," and so I was not even convinced at the beginning. But then I said, "Well, it's a good occasion to implement the knowledge of the city and to bring more work on it, because so much work still has to be done." And so that was the first idea. I was also lucky because I was able to put together a good team of students and my assistants. So we were able to add lots of minor, but not really minor monuments, like mosques that were in the city itself, tombs, etc., around that I didn't survey in the first time. So the first problem is that I think that more or less, all the monuments are now there, and so between the first and the second, the survey of the city of the monuments of the city is still there. That is the first achievement. Then, of course, I changed a bit the perspective according to my career. So in the sense, not career, no. According to my different view of the things, in a certain way. So I was a bit more mature because it's a book of 2006. I did in 2006 and published in 2008. In which, for instance, instances, problems about typological studies were in. I had developed an ability to read the evolution and transformation of the monuments, according the typological vision. And also, I had developed an interest that I have a lot now about not only the monument, but those basic architecture of dwellings, the residence of the people, and also the fabric. So, in that sense, this vision it was introduced into the second book, and that doesn't change the general perspective, but it introduces other elements, including problems of construction that were not so developed in the first book. Well, that's it. Now, what I want to say is that, in any case, that the work is not complete. It's not finished. There's a lot that can be done, and I made. Well, I can make a list if you want.
Well, sir, I mean, naturally, I mean, Fathpur Sikri is so massive, so complex, that so much has been written on it. In spite of there is so much more which can be said about it. I mean, that was also my experience when, after being inspired by you, I started working at Fathpur Sikri. In fact, when I met you in 1993-94, you introduced me to certain principles of how to actually work. Let me also tell the viewers that when I went along with Professor Atillio Petruccioli as a very young guide from Aligarh, not knowing who he was, I was just told by Professor Irfan Habib to accompany a gentleman who had come from outside. Irfan Saab did not care to tell your name to me. He just said there is somebody who's going to Fathpur Sikri and you go along with him. And when I went along with Professor Petruccioli to Fathpur Sikri, the first half of the day, soon after reaching there till about lunchtime, I, as a research scholar, was very confident about my knowledge of Fathpur Sikri, and Professor Petruccioli was inquiring about the various structures which are there, and I was, in fact, telling him what was what. Uh, I, at that time, was very confident that here is some European who knows nothing about Fathpur Sikri.
Now,
Yeah.
the line is very disturbed, and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah.
have difficulty in understanding. But
Yeah, yeah. I will come to that. I will explain to you. I'm just telling the viewers about my experience when I visited the place along with you. The second half of the day after lunch was the period till around 5 p.m. in the evening that Professor Attilio Petruccioli, in fact, took me along and showed me his own perspective about the city. How he was, reducing every structure to a grid pattern, and how he was, in fact, viewing the city, his own views, which he is expressing to us today. A very short version of that was given to me by particularly sir that day uh, at Fathpur Sikri, and that led me to do my own work at Fathpur Sikri. The only difference between your work and mine is that I look at Fathpur Sikri from the perspective of a historian. You rightly pointed out that you tried to look at Fathpur Sikri from the point of view of an architect. Now, while answering my question, you pointed out that your publisher was also in love with Fathpur Sikri, and that is why he asked you to do that second book of yours. What I would like to ask you is that I have heard that you also fell in love not only with Fathpur Sikri but with the personality of the man who made this capital. I am told that you have also kept the name of one of your sons as Akbar. Would you try to respond to this?
Well, I would say first of all that the line is very broken, so I pick up some words here and there, and it's not easy for me to understand. What I will try to reply, and then let's see if I was able to understand your question. Um, it's clear that in every human activity, there are two components that are important. One is the reality that you analyze, the nature and the reality and the context, and the other is the subject that looks at that context. And the subject, of course, is a mind that has a certain culture and education, and a way of looking at the reality that will be different from another subject, of course. That just to explain the fact that it's not only a question of historians and architects; it's also a question of Indians and Italians, for instance, because I went to India with my culture and with my eyes, let's say. And of course, the reading that I gave of Fathpur Sikri, particularly at the beginning, was that of an Italian. For instance, I was shocked by similarities, let's say, that I found between Fathpur Sikri and Villa Adriana, which is near Rome, and it's a huge settlement. It's a huge court city made by the Emperor Adrian. No relation in reality, because I'm sure that Akbar never heard about Adrian, and Adrian lived 1500 years before. But I made that connection, and I made that connection because I'm Italian, of course, and probably, you know, it may be useful for to understand certain things, maybe not. But anyway, just to explain what means the difference of the subject that read a certain reality, of course. Therefore, no problem, and it is good that there are several different approaches, several different books written about a certain context, because that will be a way of enriching the problem. And same for Fathpur Sikri. The more people at different cultures and different scholars approach the problem, the better it is. The more let's say, different disciplines look at that reality, the better it will be to understand that reality. Particularly because the sources are not extremely rich, because the archaeology is still on the way, let's say, because we know the problems of India, that archaeology becomes a political problem, and all that and so on. So in that sense, different approaches will be useful.
Sir,
Um,
sir, I mean, I agree with you naturally. But what I can understand from what you are telling us is number one, that one of your inspirations at looking at Fathpur Sikri was the fact that you are an accomplished architect. Number two, what you told us was that you were looking uh, uh, towards the capital of Akbar from a European perspective, right? These are the two things which you have just explained to me. That you were looking at Fathpur Sikri from a fresh point of view as an Italian, naturally marking things which an Indian scholar would not. Number two, as you said, and we also agree with that you were looking at Fathpur Sikri from the viewpoint of its structural remains being an architect. What other sources or works did you consult? Any primary sources, any further readings which you did on Fathpur Sikri in order to understand what type of city, what type of people you were going to work for?
Okay, to to attach myself to what I was saying previously, after my graduation in architecture, I joined the School of Oriental Studies of Venice, and so I was trained as an Orientalist, let's say, okay, working on India. I selected the point of India. But it doesn't. But all that, of course, opened to me a culture and so on. But didn't change my vision of the world for the simple reason that my self consciousness is European. Okay, but I don't. I open myself to also to the Indian culture as much as possible. But nevertheless, I remained different from an Indian scholar. No, because if you are Indian, you are Indian. You are grown in a culture and in a mentality and in a vision. That's to conclude this discourse. The second question that I read here is the question about Akbar. Of course, Akbar is an incredible personality, and somebody is asking me if I got in love not if I got also in love with the person of Akbar. Certainly, yes, because Fathpur Sikri and Akbar, they go together like Villa Adriana and Adrian, in the same time. I called my son Akbar at that time, and he was not very happy of it, And in fact, he's not very happy even now. He writes his name as A only. But of course, and I spend lots of time in the duck bungalow at night, looking at in the silence of the city, thinking what he was thinking.
Any primary sources of Akbar's period which you read in order to
No,
understand?
I was not able to read the primary sources. I read only the translations through the English translations. So I read the Aini Abari through the translation of Blockman and the Akbar Nama through a translation and so on. Badauni also through the translations. So I cannot claim myself as a philologist.
Fine. Sir, but before you, there were many scholars who worked on Fathpur Sikri. I will name only two of them, with whom you might have come into contact, because they are not much before your time. One was Professor Atillio Petruccioli, who, along with A.J. Flynn, did an excellent work on Fathpur Sikri. The other name which I would take is the name of Mr. Satish Davar, who was also working in 1970s at Fathpur Sikri, and I presume that you might have come into contact with the work of his work while you were doing your explorations at Fathpur Sikri. Around 1974, Satish Davar was also writing papers in order to explain the town planning of Fathpur Sikri. For example, he did write one of his addresses which he presented in London in some society which has been published and is now available. So, can you tell us something? Did you draw any inspiration or any influence from the works of A. Atillio Petruccioli and B. Satish Davar?
Yes, both. Rizvi, I also met him personally, and I studied carefully his book, and I agree on many of his attributions in terms of functions and so on. He was a philologist, let's say, if I can say that. So he had a deep knowledge of the original sources and so on. So his work was very helpful for me also. Of course, some other functions maybe I'm not convinced, but I the real problem of the functions is that we don't have to be crazy to establish a function for every space of Fathpur Sikri, because we have to remember that before the modern age, the modern era, most of the buildings were extremely flexible, and therefore the functions were flexible and changing and so on. So there was not such rigid functionality and so on that we have today. No, where is the bathroom? Where is the bathroom? Where is the dining room? Where is the bedroom and so on? Davar, I know the two publications. He wrote two articles because he died. Two articles on Fathpur Sikri, and of course it was interesting. It was quite interesting, his work and so on. Though I I didn't follow the idea that there was a general plan, a layout, geometrical layout for all the city. Okay, that the plan of Fathpur Sikri responds to only one drawing made as a project that in a certain way anticipated the city itself. I have more the impression, and I try to give the impression, that the plan of Fathpur Sikri comes from a process of additions, but also changes, that went on as a work in progress, but following certain guidelines, let's say, but guidelines that are more the standards, grids, certain alignments of certain elements and so on, that are typical more of a person like Akbar that sits in the site work and say, okay, let's do this, instead of somebody sitting. So to resume, I have the impression that the suggestion of Davar is the idea of an architect that thinks that Akbar sat at the desk and made a plan and a drawing, which is not, in my opinion.
Sir, Professor Petruccioli, I asked especially the question of Satish Davar to you because of two things. One, as you rightly explained, that basically, just like you, what you did in your work, although you went far ahead than what Satish Davar had done, he also made a mega grid using Ilahi Gaz as the base of making that grid. Apart from that, we will come to this Ilahi Gaz issue in a little while. Apart from that, he also talks about a centric mosque. I have also seen that mosque. It's a very small structure within the town of Fathpur Sikri, a little far away from the palatial complex, which, according to Satish Davar's article, is the focal point, making of Fathpur Sikri, that presidential address of his. He says that that is the focal point of the whole town planning of Fathpur Sikri. Then he says that apart from that, there is a sarai, Pukhta Sarai, or the Chahar Souk, I mean, I call it differently, and the Masjid-e Sang Tarashan. All these three structures are in fact predating Akbar's buildings, and it is these three structures which provide us the access for building up this whole town of Fathpur Sikri. Now, if I understand your work correctly, whether in your article which you had published in process involved in the construction of Fathpur Sikri in environmental design, or in your first book, there you try to point out that the focal point is the so-called Hiran Minar, which was the center of the whole planning of Fathpur Sikri. So my question to you is, how would you rate Satish Dawar's views which he expressed? Did you take that into consideration?
Well, the famous issue of the now you reminded me the question that was Satish Dhawan called that little mosque the central mosque because he is imagining a plan in which the focus of the composition is the central mosque that is located near the bazaar. I didn't think it was okay. I still remain with the idea that there's no a clear composition, geometrical. There's no an a priori project made by an architect behind, but there is a project that went on for 14 years until Akbar was there. Of course, probably Akbar was helped by people that were more than masons, let's say, no, and we know for sure that there were some instruments of reference for the design of the buildings. They used the grid, no, a little grid, but that was like the sheets that the kids use in the elementary school, to make mathematics and so on. Well, that's a very generic support. I don't believe that there was a clear, strong project like, let's say, New Delhi made by Lachans. Okay, there Lachans went to New Delhi. He made a plan, very academic and so on. He drew everything, and that's it. I think that, on the contrary, it came with the time. I don't think at the end that there is a central Iran Minar, that the Iran Minar had this idea of being the central, the reference for all the project. The Iran Minar most probably is being the entrance of the Mughal camp, because that I believe that was a sort of Akash Dia of the camp. Therefore, that was a symbolic, important point of reference. That is the point of reference, just to put a minimum of a layout, of the general layout. But the project went on in time, of course, following the general scheme of the camp, of the Mughal camp. That I believe very much. And
Right.
I think that a serious study of the Mughal camp still should be done. It
Fine,
is,
sir. Right, right.
still something that is not very clear, but I believe that.
Well, one last question on Satish Dawar, and that is that when he made that crude, childish grid of his, as you rightly said, that anyone working with mathematics can do that. But what he did was that he measured it as ilahi gas. Hmm. Uh, when you make your mega grid, you also make it of 1000 ilahi gas. You also mention the same term ilahi gas. You divide your 1000 ilahi gas mega grid into 500, then 250, and then so on and so forth, and you start putting up each and separate monuments in them and trying to see whether they align with this grid or not, and you come to the conclusion that some of them do not. Now, my question to you is, sir, that Satish Dawar was actually very wrong in claiming that it was the Ilahi Gas. Ilahi Gas was a measurement which was introduced by Akbar only after the abandonment of the city of Fathpur Sikri. But you
Um,
also use the same metrics to make your own grid.
uh, the line was disturbed, but
Yeah.
I hope that I have understood your issue. Let's say this. Um, it is when I say that the city was a project in the making. It doesn't mean that, for instance, those people operating in the guilds and the masons and so on, they did not have a standard of reference. The local masons and the masons that worked for him, they shared a system of measurement that probably was also Unitarian, and we can assume that the standard was based on the Eli gas, that was the royal gas. We know also that there are several
Sir, that
gas,
is what I am
as you
saying,
can.
that the Royal Ilahi Gaz of Akbar was instituted after the abandonment of Fathpur Sikri. At the time when Fathpur Sikri was being made, the Ilahi Gaz was not there.
That is another point, because the gas that is about 81 or 82, it was established by Shah Jahan officially, if I am not wrong. But we we have assumed that was going on. That they had a standard. We also can verify through the also previous monuments that existed even before Akbar. They used the standards, because that's part of the way the people do. They don't invent a standard. The problem is, and that is not only a problem related to India, but in general, the problem is that the 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 standard, the measurements in general, they were established quite late, and they in general correspond to the establishment of a nation or a big empire and so on. So the Roman Empire, they're on. That was based on the foot, that is about 29 centimeters, and that is the signature of a civilization. But otherwise, often, every city had his own standard, and that is another big problem. In the Islamic world, for instance, there is even a book made by a German, that is a typical German book, named Inz. He establishes that he made a list of all the standards used in construction in the Islamic world, and you will see that there are differences from one city to the other. So what I want to say is this: we find not only Fatehpur Sikri but also in Delhi, planned by Shah Jahan, the use of the Lai gas, of these standards. That means that they had it. And about Fatehpur Sikri, maybe there was a standard that corresponds to the 81, 82 centimeters. or maybe not. I don't know.
Fine, sir. I mean, at the time when you were doing your first work, I mean, unfortunately, sir, because I have not at all seen your second book. I have just gone through this first book of yours, which is actually quite excellent. One may agree with certain points,
The
one
line,
may not, but it's an excellent work. But as far as the second work is concerned, I have, although you send me a PDF of that work, but being in Italian, I have been unable to actually go through it. Uh, so,
the line is disturbed. The
yeah,
line
yeah.
is disturbed. Can you write the question down? Can you write the
No, no.
question?
Yeah, but um, what I am saying, okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Uh,
I The line is so disturbed that I don't understand.
I'm
If you can
asking,
write down the question,
okay,
I will.
I am asking uh, about the fact that when you started doing your second book, by that time, the ASI had already excavated these structures. When you were doing your first book, excavations were starting. When you did your second book, excavations had taken place. Did you take those excavations into consideration in your second work?
Um, I in the second book, I was aware of, and I also mentioned, all the discoveries made by the Aligarh University excavations in the area of the Samosa Mahal and so on. And so in the second book, I took in consideration the excavation that was published. So because I read the publication that I have, I didn't go very much into further analysis about the geometry and the standards. As you can see, they don't have the same weight that they had in the first. So
Right, sir. Okay, so my last question mm, from my side. Uh, you have been you lived at Fatehpur Sikri for months. You were there in the dark Bangalore, as you yourself said. Uh, you must be aware about the kind of work which Archaeological Survey of India is doing. So,
no.
how would you rate the Archaeological Survey of India in preserving and conserving the site of Fatehpur Sikri?
But well, this open a big question, and also involves problems of theory of conservation. Um, um, okay, let's start from the general problem. That's very close to my interest. The general problem says that you you can preserve a building an historical building with different mentalities. Again, suppose that if you are a member of the Archaeological Survey of India, in that case, you agree totally with the current theories about conservation, in particular the Charter of Venice. The Charter of Venice is an expression of the Western modernism. The Western modernist basically was not interested into history. Um, they neglected history, or they said that history should be in the museum. There's nothing we can learn from history. And therefore, an important part of the Charter of Venice says that whatever you do in the conservation or restoration of the building should be clearly visible as a sort of modern or different intervention. So, in few words, the Charter of Venice and the ideology of the Archaeological Survey of India follows the idea that that they don't believe in continuity of the history. On the opposite, if you in the past, before the Charter of Venice and before all those theories, the people that used to restore the monuments, they simply used to work in continuity with the history. If a tile or if a break of Fathpur Sikri used to be broken, at a certain point there were the same workers there using the same stone coming from Bayana with the same technology, and they used to replace the piece simply. And of course, the new piece was authentic, like any other piece of Fathpur Sikri, for the same reason that I have mentioned. And what are the consequences of a certain philosophy that derive from the Charter of Venice? That, for instance, when you have a portico of Fathpur Sikri with columns, and you have five, particularly in the Jahangir Palace, the so-called Jahangir Palace, in the precinct of the Chishti family, you see that 4 columns exist. The fourth column, the last one that is missing, they don't make a column, okay, made like a normal column made out of red stone and so on, but they made a sort of pilaster of bricks to show that it is different. And that, disturbs the reading and the interpretation of a monument clearly, because you create something that is so different and so on. So I made this example that is a sort of example at the limit, but this is something that usually often happens in Fathpur Sikri. In my opinion, this is wrong. Okay? For instance, there are different approaches in India, different from the archaeological survey, that are more connected with the idea of, getting in continuity and in touch with the history. So if you know that you have 5 columns, that 4 columns of the authentic of the time of Akbar, perfect, and you have the knowledge, the material, and everything to make the 5th exactly like the other one, make a column. Otherwise, you disturb the interpretation and the understanding of the buildings and the architecture. Besides that, we also have to say, to be honest, that the Archaeological Survey of India in the last 100 years, or maybe more, from Marshall onward, they have done a lot of work trying to preserve the city and so on, in spite of lack of financial support and in spite of many difficulties and so on. So what they do, they definitely, luckily, they exist so that they can try to protect as much as possible that wonderful complex that is Fathpur Sikri.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to go deeper into this issue of the conservation, because this is a very complex issue, but it's a very, very important.
Thank you, Professor, for your candid views, which you expressed today. Much later than your work, in 2013, I came up with this book on Fathpur Sikri, Fathpur Sikri Revisited, where I tried to look at many other aspects, which unfortunately not many have seen. If your work is basically based on the architecture and structural remains, if Athar Abbas Rizvi's work is based only on collection of source materials, what I tried to do in my work was to take into account not only the primary source material, and believe me, there is much that periods in Akbar's period sources talking much about this particular town of Fathpur Sikri. There's much information. I took that into account. I also took into account the information as contained in the Mughal miniatures. Some of them showing when it was being built, other miniatures when the structures had been completed. I took that into account. I also took into account the archaeological excavations, for example, the various stables and other material which was coming out. The so-called Ibadat Khana, which you referred to, with which I do not agree. I also took into account a lot of other, type of sources, which generally the other books of history had not done so. I also tried to, add one, chapter. I don't know, it's not visible here, but I did an
Well, it's
appendix.
not visible from here,
Yeah,
but anyway, I trust you.
yeah, one appendix, which was appendix 2 in my book, on conservation and preservation of Fathpur Sikri. The question which I asked you about what you think about the role of Archaeological Survey of India in conserving Fathpur Sikri, I have added an appendix on that in my book, and I have tried to show how much more could have been done in by using the same resources which were available to the Archaeological Survey of India. They did not need further grants to do work. They could have done much more. By the way, after your work was completed, Fathpur Sikri was declared as the World Heritage Site. And that is why, much more importance was tried to be given at Fathpur Sikri. I was witness at Fathpur Sikri, sir, much after you had left, at the assets being provided by the world agencies for cleaning the walls, and ASI officers throwing that asset on the wall paintings, so much so that certain of the paintings which I had catalogued, photographed, were removed from the scene. They were just erased by the scrubbing and by the acid which was thrown on them by none else but by the Archaeological Survey of India officers themselves. So I think that we historians and you architects who have worked at Fathpur Sikri should also, point out these facts to those who have been given the charge to look after the town which is known as Fathpur Sikri, which today is a World Heritage Site. Now, with these words, I throw open your talk to the questions which have been asked by the public, by those who are participating. May I have the questions, please? Could Professor Petruccioli shed some light on what might have been the approximate size of the city? And the type of architectural design?
There is a question. Thank you, Professor, for the opportunity that you have given to me. Also, to talk about issues that I jumped in my analysis, but that I think are important. That if I had another life, I could also investigate. Definitely, the question of conservation is something extremely important and still open. Okay, in the sense that there are different schools and they different approaches also, and the approach is essential because you can create different results. Um, but we could open this thing in a special session that we can discuss about that in detail. Um, Now, there is a question that is written here by a gentleman that I would like to reply because it's something that is interesting for me. I cannot tell you the size of Fathpur Sikri, particularly in terms of population, because we don't have really sources, and so we can calculate. But I also, in the books, I have given some numbers according to the secondary sources, or interpretation of other people, that go from something almost impossible that arrives up to 200,000 people, which is unthinkable, up to something that is much more dimensionally more logic, that is something like 10,000 or something like that. Depends how you interpret the city, the court, and the role of the court within the city. I don't think it was so big because at the end the army could have been located not necessarily next to the palace, but probably around, and so on and so forth. But the second question that is very interesting to me is the question of the design technique. In the last years, I have been rethinking the role of the architecture of Fathpur Sikri, not only limited in the city itself, but also in the surrounding, and also in a chronological perspective. For instance, I have been convinced, for instance, that the tendency of many scholars, including me in the past, to find references, formal references, and so on, very far from Fathpur Sikri, even in Uzbekistan, Bukhara, or Samarkand, or in other Islamic countries, and so on. It was probably a sort of a natural reaction to the fact that it was a Muslim dynasty and so on, and they were coming from Uzbekistan. In reality, if you have the opportunity to travel around, to see Bayana, for instance, to see also centers that are 50 kilometers away, you realize that most of the references and most of the technology and most of the workers were coming from the area. I think that the role of Bayana is vital. And in the last time, I started looking at some buildings in Bayana, particularly in the residential dwellings and so on, that in my opinion are part of a process, of a morphological process that goes also through Fathpur Sikri. There are certain courtyard houses in Bayana we have based on the private system that is a quick system of building that actually conceptually is not the logic of building on the masons, it is the logic of building on the carpenters. Okay, that way of assembling pieces, and that actually you find in Bayana 200 years before, 100 years before. So I think that this thing opens a field of investigation that is very interesting, and that also goes far behind Fathpur Sikri itself. So the residential typologies, of the Havelis in Rajasthan and so on, northern Rajasthan particularly, are deeply depending from this process that actually went through Fathpur Sikri and that was born probably in Bayana or even before. So this is an open field of investigation. That is very interesting.
Thank you, Professor Petruccioli. You, Hassan, I would also like to respond, add something to what Professor Atillio Petruccioli just, said regarding two of your questions. I would suggest that you, Hassan, please go through one of the articles of Professor Irfan Habib, which he did in Brand and Laurie's famous work, which also contains, a paper by Petruccioli himself, which was a result of a grand symposium by the MIT on Fathpur Sikri, uh, mm, which was, Akbar's India, Art from the Mughal City of Victory, published in 1985. Now, in that, there is a paper by Irfan Habib, the economic and social settings. And in this paper, Irfan Habib goes on to analyze, using various sources, both Persian as well as the European travelers' accounts, to come out with a type of the population which might have been surviving at Fatehpur Sikri. So there is, at the moment, I don't actually remember correctly how much by giving all those data, what type of population he works up at. But an attempt has been made by Irfan Habib by doing that. However, I would just read out a passage from Ralph Fitch, one of the travelers who visited the town of Fatehpur Sikri in 1584, 1 year prior to its being abandoned by Akbar as the imperial city. 1584. Abandonment took place in 1585. Now, Ralph Fitch writes, and I quote him, "The town is greater than Agra, but the houses and streets be not so fair. Here dwell many people, both Moors and Gentiles. He, that is Akbar, keepeth a great court, which they call Derikam. Agra and Fatehpur," please pay attention to this line, "Agra and Fatehpur are two very great cities, either of them much greater than London and very populous." And Rolf Fitch is not the only traveler who mentions the populous city as it was at a time when it was the capital under Akbar. So, there are references, there are quite a few references within the texts, both the chronicles of the foreign travelers as well as the Persian sources, which tell us that Fatehpur Sikri was in fact having within itself a large population. Possibly, if I remember correctly, what Irfan Habib tried to work out, he said that somewhere the population was between 20,000 and above. I am forgetting the other figure, but it was well populated for that period of time. Khushbu Kumari is asking a question. First of all, I would like to say thanks to the panelists for such a wonderful talk. I would like to know, does ideology play an important role in the construction of Fatehpur? Or can we just see construction of Fathpur Sikri merely in the light of architecture?
Well, if it was a question I didn't pick up because it was disturbed, um, I read here a question by Kumari that says it's about the question of the ideology, and he wants to know if the construction of Fathpur Sikri was due to more to an ideological approach, or if it was just merely done in the light of architecture. And I think it's a very interesting question, but not difficult to reply. All the great politicians, all the great kings, emperors, and dictators also, they are perfectly aware of the power of architecture, the power that has architecture to convey the idea of the representation of the power, support the power, and so on. So most of the, with the exception of the basic architecture that is the dwellings, the houses, and the fabric of the normal people, all the architecture with the big A is always extremely influenced by the ideology. Um, the ideology, the funny thing is that ideology, the bad ideology, maybe could make beautiful architecture, or a bad ideology can, or a wonderful ideology can make bad architecture. The two things are not immediately related. It depends on the ability of the politicians to select good architects. Clearly, in the case of Fathpur Sikri, it is evident, in my opinion, that it was a big logical statement. The king wanted to reinforce his status. In the court, he was challenged. He had problems and so on. So he takes the court from Agra and moves the court to Fathpur Sikri. I see in this operation a very strong similarity with the operation made by the king, the king of France, the so-called the Roi Soleil, the Louis XIV, that moved from the court from Paris to Versailles. Okay, number one. Second, he created a wonderful context where the court could play and so on, but not against him. And also, through a big statement of architecture, you reinforce your image of power. Definitely. Imagine only this. This is my opinion. When even the most visible element is the bull, which has no religious meaning. It is at the entrance to the mosque, but it is the entrance to the mosque from the city, and it is a huge structure, 53 meters tall, that can be visible, from very far, from all the land that he had just conquered. I think it's enough
Yeah,
to
I think
explain this idea.
I would also totally agree with Professor Petruccioli, Khushbu, that ideology does play a great part in
Okay.
the setting. And
Fathpur Sikri is
just a moment, sir. Just a moment, sir. I would ask
okay.
her to read, one article by Elena MacLean, which is on the stone encampment, where she tries to give this argument regarding the ideology behind the making of Fathpur Sikri. I would also strongly recommend that please do see my book of Fathpur Sikri. Now, Sudeep Sahu asks, please tell about water distribution system at Fathpur Sikri. So, yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't pick up your reply, Professor Rezavi.
Yeah.
Listen, I can reply to the question that is written there about the water distribution of Fathpur Sikri, if you want.
Yes.
That is one of the things that still, in my opinion, deserve a study, and it's very important. And I see, that now in India, more and more, the problem of hydraulics related to the architecture, but not only, are put at the attention of scholars. And there are more and more publications. I think now, talking of Fathpur Sikri, I was able to retrace all the system of lifting of the water from both the two bowlies on both sides of the ridge up to the palace. I made a very schematic, not very precise drawing of the plan of the hydraulics in the palace. Deserves much more attention, not only in one plan, but also in the elevation to see how it works. For instance, also other of catching the water. Other wells, important also, that were along the shores of the lake or in the palace, and those are not being investigated at all. So I think that in the future, I am retired, so I don't have any more this power. But if I were still teaching in a university, I would I would give theses of students, small things, to investigate certain specific problems of Fathpur Sikri. One is certain areas, the problem in certain areas of the hydraulics. The other question is the gardens. I have detected 11 gardens. There were many more. So, of course, that will require probably intelligent use of the infrared aerophotos, and also walking and looking at the structures that are available, and maybe radar systems of investigating the archaeology without excavating. So a system that, but I'm sure that that is another field that should be investigated. And third field is all the area of the chistic water that preserves wonderful structures. I have made a survey 1 to 500 that is, just a bit more than schematic, but that will deserve a survey 1 to 50, very, very precise, because it will reveal a lot of interesting things. What about the villages of Nagar and Sikri? They have been only the mosque have been studied, but the fabric preserves interesting structures that will need attention and so on.
I think Sudeep, you got much information from what Professor Petruccioli just told you. I will just add further to what he has said, and that is that during my own surveys at Fathpur Sikri, which were conducted after he had completed his work, I found around 13 step wells at Fathpur Sikri. 13 step wells at Fathpur Sikri, and around more than 80 wells at Fathpur Sikri, as well as uh, 14 surviving gardens at Fathpur Sikri, which shows that, I mean, the water conservation, hydraulics is something which was crucially important as far as Fathpur Sikri is concerned. Professor Atillio Petruccioli has given the diagrams in his book on both the northern and southern waterworks of Fathpur Sikri. How from the side of the Hathipol water was being drawn and brought to the palace, and then from the southern side, both these things have been actually given by Professor Petruccioli in his first book itself. I have added to that in my own book and tried to, add certain other aspects which possibly he had missed out and which were apparently there at Fatehpur Sikri. So I would say that the distribution system of water was quite complex at Fatehpur Sikri. Lifting the water from the stage of the lake and bringing it on the top of the hill was, a very complicated task. And uh, you know, uh, uh, through various stages, large number of water tanks, large number of bowlies, the water was being, supplied to the entire population of the city. Sudeep, you will be interested to know that even till date, as we speak, there is one stepwell of Akbar which is still supplying water to the city of Fatehpur today. So, I mean, and that has been surveyed and the plan has been given by Attilio Petruccioli in his first book. Next question. Any other question? Um, well, I think there was one other question, if I remember. There was some question. Yes. Uh, some people accuse that Fatehpur Sikri is built on Jain city. This is true. Also, why Emperor Akbar wished to shift the capital from Agra to Fatehpur Sikri, then abandoned it after.
Okay. Very good question. The first part of the question, this question of the Jain city is a typical Indian preoccupation, Indian problem. It's obvious that under the city you have another city, and under another city you have an older city, because that is the life. This is the way the cities grow, one on top of the other. And there's no big problem in it. No, most probably there was a Jain settlement. Okay, so what? No problem. We have in Italy. We are acquainted that our cities have at least 6 meters of stratas. And every strata has an historical meaning. What is wrong and what would be horrible would be that of destroying the upper part of the city just to recover one of those strata to give to them a political meaning. That is very, very wrong and dangerous, because at that point, you select one part of the story, of your story, and you privilege one part of your story. In my opinion, the history is a process, and we have to take it all together. We cannot select what we prefer. And because that is our story, okay? India is made out of several strata, and you have to take it's made of many stratas and contributions, and that's part of the story. So I think that the political use of history is very dangerous wherever it happens. This to reply to the question of the city. The other question was a modern scientific value of Fathpur Sikri. I wouldn't define that a modern scientific learning or whatever. What we can learn of Fathpur Sikri, what is extremely interesting, is the idea of process, in my opinion, that I have acquired in time and later, not at the beginning when I studied Fathpur Sikri. Through different studies, I think that what is interesting in studying a complex like Fathpur Sikri or other similar studies is the stratification and the contributions along the time, the variations, the modifications, and so on. The idea of process, because the idea of process brings together the idea of life. That is at the basis of making architecture. Great,
Uh,
thank you, Professor.
our, yes, sir, I will just add for Mr. Hasnan that what Professor Petruccioli said, nothing very spectacular if there are earlier cities buried within the one which is on the top. But unfortunately, for those proponents who talk about Jain or Hindu city below Fathpur Sikri, remember that on the top of the ridge, there is only one phase of construction. There is nothing below. The only place where you start getting, pre-Mughal, pre-Akbar remains are on the besides the lake, where you start getting, sequences from PGW where onwards. There is one particular area known as Bir Sabili Das Tila, from where certain Jain idols were located, were brought out, and that a campaign was started in order to establish that as if there was a Jain city which was demolished by Akbar and his capital was built. There was nothing of that sort. It was basically the whole city of Fatehpur, which was constructed by Akbar, is on top of the ridge, and that is the area where there is nothing below it. As far as the why the abandonment of Fathpur Sikri took place, I would very much recommend you to go through one of the chapters of my book. It was not shortage of water at all. Professor Atillio Petruccioli has also tried to establish that there was sufficient quantity of water which was available. There were political reasons behind the fact that Akbar left that city, went somewhere else, never returned back. But that is another story. Suffice to say that shortage of water was not one of the reasons for the abandonment of Fathpur Sikri. I think Professor Atillio Petruccioli, that has been more than 1.5 hours since we have been in discussion with you. I think although there are many other questions, but we have to stop somewhere, and we would stop at this particular moment of time. I would take this opportunity to thank you once again. It was a real pleasure to hear an expert on Fathpur Sikri talk on the subject. As far as Fathpur Sikri is concerned, there are many so-called experts. If you go to any bookstore in India, at least, you would find that there is surfeit of material which has been written on Fathpur Sikri without adding anything to our knowledge. But your works are one of those which have immensely added to the knowledge about the town of Fathpur Sikri, the capital city of Akbar. Thank you very much for agreeing to come and present your views before us. And we would expect in the end that we may, if you agree, call you once again for a larger discussion on some of the themes which we just scratched on the surface. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm only sorry that sometimes the line was going and coming, and probably I didn't pick up exactly all the questions, and probably my questions were not
No, no,
sufficient.
they did.
But
Yeah.
I wish that we have an opportunity to have another discussion after some time
Yes.
with new ideas. I mean, or with some additions. I'm working in this period on the um, housing and urban fabric of the Akbar period and so on in a wider area in Rajasthan and so on. And I'm quite exciting from what I'm finding. So I would like to share that in the future, uh, this idea
Thank
with
you,
you
sir.
and so on. And of course, I'm curious to know what you discovered because you are in India. So you are in advantage. You have everything under your hands. Thank you for
Uh,
inviting me, and thank you for the
Thank
opportunity
you, sir.
that you gave to me.
Well, friends, ladies and gentlemen who joined today, you had a perspective from an architect's point of view. Attilio Petruccioli is an architect, is not a student of history at all. In spite of that, his book is very, very relevant for us to understand about Fathpur Sikri. But you know, I would be I would be taking up his offer, which he gave at the end, and that was that I would, at some point of time, would like to discuss Fathpur Sikri from the perspective of a historian. There is much written material, both in Persian, both in non-Persian sources, in paintings, illustrations, miniatures, as well as the archaeological and architectural data, which provides us much, much information than we expect. In fact, let me just end on this note that when I started working on Fathpur Sikri, I was also in the impression that our sources are generally silent. But to my surprise, almost each and every aspect of the town has been written about, and there is something or the other through which we can actually reconstruct the past. For a historian, the only thing is to ask a relevant question. It is only if you ask a question, it is only then that you start getting the answers. I would, in the end, once again thank Professor Attilio Petruccioli. He's a very senior architect who did excellent work in his field. One may agree with some of his works, one may not agree with some of his works, but after all, the scholarship is such that he gave us much on which we can develop further. With this, we end this program. In the last, I would just give one announcement for you, and that is that in the coming week, the coming Saturday, we would be having Tushar Gandhi with us to discuss about Gandhiji on 13th of November, Saturday, same time at 7 p.m., we would be having Tushar Gandhi to talk on Do We Deserve Gandhi? That would be his topic. With this, uh, please, goodbye. Meet you next week. Thank you for joining with us.